This is a quiet story, told slowly. There's nothing you need to do, and nothing you need to remember. You can listen closely, or let the words fade into the background as you rest. The story will move gently, without sudden moments, and it will stay with you whether you're awake or drifting off. Tonight's story is The Bench by the Sea. Margaret arrived at the bench just as the light began to thin. She had timed it that way, without thinking about it, guided by the same quiet instinct that had brought her here for years. The path down to the water curved gently, bordered by low grass and pale stone, worn smooth by weather. The sea lay open and calm, its surface broken only by the slow, patient movement of tide against shore. The bench stood where it always had, set slightly back from the edge, its wooden slats bleached by sun and salt. The metal arms were cool when Margaret rested her hands on them, the chill travelling lightly into her palms. She did not sit immediately. She rarely did. There was a moment she always allowed, a pause between arrival and rest, as though acknowledging the place before claiming it. The air carried the familiar scent of water and kelp and distant rain. Somewhere along the beach below, a gull called once, then fell silent. The town behind her had begun to soften into evening. Doors closed. Footsteps faded. Lights appeared one by one, faint and steady. Margaret sat. From here, the sea filled her vision without effort. She did not need to lean forward or adjust her position. The horizon rested where it always had, a pale line holding sky and water apart without tension. She let her shoulders settle and felt the bench take her weight, the wood shaped by countless other bodies before her own. She had first come here many years ago, though she no longer counted exactly how many. At the time, she had been younger in ways that were not only measured by age. She remembered sitting on this same bench with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the water as though it might offer instruction. She had not known what she was waiting for then, only that she did not yet feel finished with something she could not name. Now, the waiting felt different. Margaret watched the tide draw itself back, then return, the movement so gradual it barely registered unless one stayed long enough to notice. She had learned that lesson here. Things changed even when they appeared still, especially then. The bench creaked softly as she adjusted her position, crossing her ankles beneath it. She rested her hands on her thighs and breathed out slowly. The sound of the sea folded into her breathing without interruption, neither leading nor following. It simply matched. She did not bring anything with her. No book, no bag, no phone. She had stopped bringing distractions some time ago. The bench was not a place for filling time. It was a place for letting it pass. As the light dimmed further, the colours of the world simplified. Blues deepened. Greys softened. The water reflected less detail, holding only movement and sheen. Margaret felt her thoughts do the same, releasing their sharper edges. She thought briefly of the other times she had sat here, not in order, not as a sequence of events, but as impressions. The bench in brighter light, the bench in wind, the bench when the sea had been rougher, its voice louder, demanding attention rather than offering it. Through all of it, the bench had remained. Not unchanged exactly, just present. Margaret had come here during years that felt full, and during years that felt thin. She had come when there were people waiting for her elsewhere, and when there were not. The bench had never asked which version of her she was bringing. It had accepted the weight all the same. A small wave reached farther up the shore than the others, leaving a darker band of sand before retreating. Margaret watched it without assigning meaning. She had learned over time that not every movement required interpretation. Some things were allowed to happen without becoming symbols. The air cooled slightly, and she drew her cardigan closer around her shoulders. The fabric held warmth without effort. She shifted again, finding the place where the bench supported her best. There was always a moment of adjustment, a quiet negotiation between body and object, and then a shared stillness. Margaret's gaze returned to the horizon. She did not feel the need to measure the evening. She did not wonder how long she would stay. The bench had never required that decision in advance. She would leave when the moment loosened its hold, when the sense of being held gave way to the pull of home and warmth and familiar rooms. For now, she remained. The sea continued its steady motion. The sky deepened. The bench held, as it always had, offering nothing more than a place to sit, and the quiet assurance that this too was enough. Margaret remained on the bench as the evening gathered itself. The first streetlights behind her came on, their glow faint through the trees and low stone walls, barely touching the path that led back toward town. From where she sat, the light did not reach the sea. The water kept its own color, deepening towards slate as the sky darkened. The horizon became less a line and more a quiet agreement between two kinds of darkness. She listened to the tide. The sound was steady and repetitive, not loud enough to interrupt thought, but constant enough to soften it. When she had been younger, she would have tried to name what she felt in moments like this. She would have reached for explanations, for decisions, for something she could carry away and claim as progress. Now she let the feeling exist without shaping it into a conclusion. A couple walked along the lower path near the shore, their voices low and indistinct, carried away by wind before words could become clear. Margaret watched them only briefly, then returned her gaze to the water. She did not feel separate from them, but she did not feel drawn into their orbit either. Their presence was part of the evening, nothing more. They passed, and the beach returned to its quieter state. The bench supported her in the small, specific ways she had come to appreciate. The slats pressed gently against her back. The metal armrest held the weight of her hand. The wood was cool where it had been shaded all day, warmer in places where the sun had reached it earlier. Margaret noticed these details, the way a person notices the familiar features of a room they have lived in for a long time. Not with wonder, but with recognition. She thought again of the first time she had come here. It had been after a day that felt crowded, full of conversations that did not settle properly in the mind. She had walked down to the sea without telling anyone, not because she wanted to hide, but because she wanted a space where no one required anything of her. The bench had been here then, quieter than the rest of the world, waiting without intention. She had sat and stared at the water until her thoughts loosened and drifted. When she eventually stood and walked home, she had not solved anything. She had simply felt less compressed. That had been enough to bring her back. Over the years, the bench became a place she returned to in different versions of herself. Margaret did not like to think in terms of eras, but life had a way of dividing itself anyway. There were years of busy days and late evenings, when she came here only occasionally, almost as an indulgence. There were years when she came more often, not out of desperation, but out of habit, as if the bench were part of the week's structure, in the same way shops and work and laundry were part of it. Some evenings she arrived feeling light, content, the sea simply a pleasant companion to a peaceful end of day. Other evenings she arrived carrying a tiredness she could not explain properly, the kind that settled behind the ribs without permission. She had learned not to interrogate that tiredness too closely. It did not always have a single cause. Sometimes the body kept its own records, storing small strains until they gathered into weight. The bench never asked her to justify what she brought. Margaret shifted slightly and rested her hands together in her lap. Her fingers were cool from the air, her knuckles faintly stiff. She flexed them once, slowly, then let them rest again. The movement felt small, unimportant, yet strangely comforting. Life, she had learned, was made of such small motions. A breeze moved in from the sea, carrying a sharper scent of salt. It brushed her cheeks and stirred her hair at the temples. Margaret drew a breath in and held it briefly, then let it out. The air tasted clean, as if the night had washed the day away. She looked down at the beach below and watched the thin line of foam left by each wave. It appeared, held for a moment, then dissolved back into the sand. The repetition was soothing. It made her thoughts slower, less inclined to chase themselves. She remembered coming here in winter once, years ago, when the wind had been so cold, it felt like it could strip away skin. She had wrapped herself in a heavy coat and sat anyway, stubborn and silent, as though she needed to prove something to the sea. The memory made her smile now, not with embarrassment, but with tenderness. She had been trying to outlast her own feelings then, trying to win against them through endurance. Time had taught her something quieter. Feelings did not need to be defeated. They needed room. The bench had offered that room. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the town. From this distance, the buildings looked smaller, their edges softened by the slope of land and the dark. The lights in windows were scattered and warm, like a handful of candles set behind glass. Somewhere in that cluster of streets was her home, its rooms familiar, its quiet waiting. She would return there later, make something simple to eat, put the kettle on, move through the gentle rituals that ended her day. The thought did not pull at her. It simply existed as the next step, steady and unthreatening. She turned back to the sea. The sky had deepened into a darker blue, and the first stars appeared, faint and steady. They did not glitter sharply. They held their light with restraint, as if aware of how easily brightness could disturb the night. Margaret watched them for a while, letting her eyes settle, letting the world become simpler. A distant boat moved along the horizon, its light small and steady, far enough away to feel harmless. Margaret did not follow it with the part of her mind that once would have turned it into story. She let it pass through the scene, like the couple's voices earlier. The sea held it for a time, then let it go. She sat a little longer. The bench creaked again, a soft sound that blended easily with tide and wind. Margaret placed her hand on the wood beside her, palm flat, feeling the texture under her skin. The grain was raised slightly in places, smoothed in others. It was evidence of weather and years. It was also evidence of care. Someone maintained this bench. even if no one made a ceremony of it. Someone had decided that a place to sit at the edge of things still mattered. Margaret let that thought settle without pushing it further. She understood, in the gentle way that understanding sometimes arrived, that the bench had never been about answers. It had been about permission. Permission to pause. Permission to be quiet. Permission to let life be imperfect and unfinished without turning it into a problem. The sea continued to move as it always had. The evening deepened around her. Margaret stayed until the air cooled further, and the sense of rest reached a natural fullness, like a cup filled to the brim. She did not leave because she was done. She left because she was ready to carry the quiet back with her. Margaret rose from the bench slowly, not because her body required it, but because the moment did. There was a subtle shift she had learned to recognize over the years. The quiet did not fade or break, but it loosened, as though it were ready to be carried rather than held in place. She stood and paused beside the bench, one hand resting briefly on the backrest, feeling the cool grain beneath her palm. The sea continued its steady movement without acknowledging her change in position. The tide did not hurry. The horizon did not adjust itself. Margaret appreciated that. Nothing in the world demanded a reaction to her presence or her departure. She could come and go without ceremony. She stepped onto the path and turned back, once, not out of habit, but out of respect. The bench looked smaller now, unoccupied, its shape softened by the gathering dark. It did not feel lonely. It felt complete, doing exactly what it was meant to do, whether someone sat upon it or not. As she walked back toward town, the sounds behind her shifted. The sea's voice grew fainter, replaced gradually by the muted signs of evening life. A door closing, cutlery clinking faintly through an open window, the distant hum of a car moving along the main road. Each sound took its place, without intrusion. Margaret walked at an unhurried pace, her steps even on the worn stones. The path rose gently, and she felt the familiar warmth return to her legs as they worked. Her breathing remained slow, settled into the rhythm she had found by the water. She carried that rhythm with her, letting it guide her rather than rushing to meet the next moment. The town greeted her without fanfare. Streetlights cast steady pools of light along the pavement, illuminating familiar corners and doorways. She passed houses she recognized without attaching names or stories to them. They were simply part of the landscape she moved through, as constant as the bench and the sea. At her door, Margaret paused again, keys in hand. She noticed a faint warmth held in the stone beside the frame, released slowly from the day's light. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it gently behind her. The quiet within was different from the quiet outside, but no less welcome. It held the shapes of rooms she knew well, the soft assurance of things in their place. She set her shoes by the door and moved through the rooms, turning on a lamp, setting her bag down. The light filled the space without glare, revealing the simple order she preferred. Margaret put the kettle on and waited as it warmed, the low sound settling into the background of her thoughts. As the water heated, she found herself thinking of the bench one last time, not with longing, not with a sense of separation, but with appreciation. It remained where it was, unchanged by her absence, ready to receive whoever might come next. That knowledge brought her a quiet satisfaction. Some places did not belong to us. We belonged to them only briefly, when we needed them. The kettle clicked off. Margaret poured the water and carried her mug to the window. Outside, the night had deepened, the street calm and evenly lit. She took a slow sip and felt the warmth move through her hands, grounding her fully in the present. When she eventually prepared for bed, she did so without replaying the evening or trying to extract meaning from it. The calm she had found by the sea settled easily into the familiar routine of closing curtains and turning off lights. Her body recognized the readiness for rest without argument. Margaret lay down and let the quiet hold her. The sound of the sea was gone now, replaced by the softer silence of home. But a feeling remained. It moved with her breath, steady and unforced. The bench would still be there tomorrow, or another evening, or not at all, if weather and time decided otherwise. For now, it was enough to know that it existed, and that she had been part of its stillness for a while. Margaret closed her eyes, carrying the calm with her as sleep arrived, unannounced and welcome.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, share and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the channel.